these coasters shouldn't exist. Year after year, coasters are being built in amusement parks around the world. Some coasters are clones, others originals, but some are so insane they shouldn't exist. And those are the coasters we'll talk about in today's video. This list is of coasters that should not exist, meaning they shouldn't have been invented yet and are way ahead of their times. Half of the coasters on this list are coasters that when they were invented were way ahead of their times and were successful, while the other half of the list is coasters invented so ahead of their times that they cause serious issues to their park, sometimes even closing after only a few years. Let's start off with an honorable mention. On the successful side, we have the S&S Axis coaster. Though this coaster has yet to be built, it's definitely way ahead of its times. It's possible the coaster ends up causing maintenance nightmares, but who knows? Since this coaster hasn't been built yet, I put it as an honorable mention. On the other side, we have King Dakar at Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey. King Dakar was one of the bunch of launch coasters Intamin built, but this one was the tallest and fastest when it opened in 2005 and remains the world's tallest coaster 16 years later in 2021. King Dakar was ahead of its times, breaking the height and speed record, but gave the park a maintenance headache. Now for 5th place. On the successful side, we have Comet at Hershey Park. Now you may be wondering why a PTC Woody built in 1946 is on this list, but that's because this coaster 75 years later is ranked better than many wooden coasters that are taller and faster that were built decades later. Comet is one of the 3 wooden coasters in Hershey Park, but in my opinion, it's the best. It has really strong air, and even though it's the oldest and smallest in the park, it still does better than 2 GCIs. Whatever PTC did for Comet in 1946, they were ahead of the times, because almost a century later, the coaster is running great and still ranks higher than many newer coasters. 5th place on the other side is Intimidator 305 at Kings Dominion in Virginia. Intimidator 305 is an Intamin Giga coaster standing at the height of 305 feet. The coaster was built back in 2010 and still ranks high on many coaster enthusiasts' favorite coaster list. When Intimidator opened, it caused the park a maintenance nightmare, and though it's an awesome ride, it was probably a little ahead of its times. Down to 4th place, starting again with the successful side. This one is the Beast at Kings Island. The Beast is a wooden coaster that opened in 1979. It's an extremely tall woody and took many records when it opened. The coaster is known to be one of the best woodies in existence and is known for its amazing night rides. Kings Island got the coaster ahead, breaking many records, and it was way ahead of its times, yet thankfully it's still a huge hit at the park, and some even rank it over Orient, a B&M Giga that opened in 2020. Now for 4th place on the other side. This one is Maverick at Cedar Point. Back in 2007, when the coaster wars between Cedar Fair and Six Flags were going strong, Cedar Fair decided not to retake the tallest coaster record from King Dakar, which was built in 2005. Instead, they decided to go from building the world's tallest and fastest coaster to build a revolutionary launch coaster. Maverick's stats aren't that impressive, standing at 105 feet, but it was a huge hit at the park. Years later, it still ranks as one of the best coasters at Cedar Point. If this coaster was so successful, you may be wondering why I put it on the other side of the list. Well, that's because when it opened, Cedar Point had to bring back Intamin to remove the Heartline roll from the coaster and replace it with some less intense track. The element was too strong and it needed to go. The ride may not be as big of a maintenance nightmare as some other coasters on this list, but being as ahead of its times as Maverick was, and the fact that it was built by Intamin tells you maintenance is probably not too fun. In 3rd place on the successful side of the list is Millennium Force. Millennium Force opened in 2000 as a first Giga coaster. Standing at 310 feet tall with over 6,000 feet of track, it opened as the world's tallest, fastest, and longest coaster. Built by Intamin, the coaster is still a fan favorite at Cedar Point. Millennium was ahead of its time, being that it broke the height record as the first Giga Coaster and broke the record with a lift hill, not a launch. Millennium is still a hit at the park, and we all should thank Cedar Point and Intamin for paving the way for all the Giga Coasters we have today. Taking the third place on the other half of the list is the Lightning Rod at Dollywood. Lightning Rod was built by RMC and they are pretty reliable. So what happened here? This coaster was the first ever wooden coaster to feature a launch. It's no regular woody and it utilizes the terrain really well. The coaster was way ahead of its times and became a maintenance nightmare for the park. The maintenance issues were so bad that Dollywood brought RMC back to do some work on hopefully fixing it up when the coaster is only a few years old. The ride is way ahead of its times, but it's not likely another will be built for a while because the coaster may just be too ahead of its times. Down to second place, where we have Hades 360 at Mount Olympus on the successful side. This coaster was the first woody to feature a successful inversion. It opened in 2005 as a regular wooden coaster called Hades and was retracked and renamed to Hades 360 for the 2013 season after the Gravity Group added an inversion. The coaster became an instant hit at the park and helped put the park on the map. Many enthusiasts rank the coaster as high as their top 20 in the United States, and for a small park to have such a successful coaster so ahead of its times is amazing. On the other side of the list, second place is taken by X2 at Six Flags Magic Mountain. X2 was the last coaster built by the now gone coaster manufacturer Aerodynamics. When this coaster opened, it looked like it came from the future, and even today it still wows many people. The coaster is a 4D coaster with seats on both sides of the track. Riders hang with no track above or beneath them and ride the 200-foot coaster while their seats are spinning the entire time. The coaster opened very late and had so many issues it pushed its manufacturer Arrow into bankruptcy. After Arrow went bankrupt, S&S purchased the rights to the coaster along with a bunch of Arrow's assets and helped Six Flags get this coaster running well. Since then, 3 more of its kind were built by S&S, the last being in 2008. The coaster was so ahead of its times it's crazy, and it paved the way for the B&M Wing Coaster, the 4D Free Spins, and the S&S Axis Coaster, all with similar kinds of concepts. X2 may have been ahead of its times, but the issues of the coaster pushed it to this side of the list. Taking first place on the successful side is Superman Ultimate Fight at Six Flags Over Georgia. Built by B&M, opened in 2002. It was the first B&M flyer to open. This wasn't the first flying coaster, but it was the first successful one. Vekoma had a flyer, but those weren't great. B&M decided to come out with their very own flyer, and the mechanics to the ride were interesting, though with B&M we're talking about, so definitely no maintenance headaches. The B&M flying model tilts riders from a sitting to a flying position before starting the ride and is the only flying coaster model in existence to do that. Vekoma now has a new generation flyer, but we will have to wait for the first to open up. The B&M flyer was way ahead of its time, and it took Vekoma 20 years to come up with an answer to it. But who knows, B&M's new surf coaster might be the second generation launch flyer, but that's for another video. On the other side, taking first place is Son of Beast at Kings Island. This coaster was so ahead of its time that it no longer exists. The coaster opened in 2000 and closed down for good in 2009. Built by Gerstlauer, the coaster was the first and only wooden coaster to feature a vertical loop. I mentioned the Beast earlier on the list, on the successful side of the list, and I'm sure Kings Island wanted Son of Beast to be even better and more evolutionary, but sometimes things don't happen the way you want them to. Son of Beast had crazy maintenance and safety issues, and after a while the park had to remove the 118-foot vertical loop. The coaster was still open to the public before Kings Island shut it down for good in 2009. Son of Beast was way too ahead of its times, and years later no one has ever again attempted a vertical loop on a wooden coaster. RMC didn't even try to put one on any of theirs, and their coasters have steel track. It's safe to say we don't see a loop on a woody for a long time. Maybe we won't ever see one, and if we do, the first one will probably not open at Kings Island. Do you agree that the 12 coasters I listed on this list were way ahead of their times? Let me know which coasters I missed on this list and maybe I'll do a part 2.